Hello and welcome to the Suzanne Atwell Show. I'm Suzanne Atwell. In this edition, Police Reform. A national conversation is underway. What are the conditions that have prompted it? Whose voices need to be heard? And why is this the moment something may get done? We begin with an event that sparked a movement. It happened in Florida, and it had nothing to do with police and everything to do with race. 17-year-old Trayvon Martin was shot and killed while he was walking home in a gated townhouse community north of Orlando. The shooter, George Zimmerman, was charged with murder. On July 13th, in a Seminole County courtroom, Zimmerman was acquitted, claiming self-defense under Florida's Stand Your Ground law. Protests erupted coast to coast. For the first time, the hashtag Black Lives Matter appeared on social media. Gun violence and racism, not police, were the targets of the protests. In 2014, two high-profile deaths of unarmed black men at the hands of police officers thrust Black Lives Matter forward in the spotlight from an advocacy group to a national movement. Eric Garner in Staten Island, New York. Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, outside St. Louis. A New York City cop murdered Eric Garner with a chokehold. The officer was acquitted.
Put your hand behind your back. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe.
The murder of George Floyd was a tipping point.
You think that's okay? Check his pulse.
Check his right.
Check his pulse.
Please, in my dick. I can't breathe shit.
Bro, get up, get in the car, man.
I will.
Get up, get in the car.
I can't move.
I've been waiting the whole time, man. Get up, get in the car.
Mama.
Get up and get in the car right.
I can't.
From 2015 to 2020, there have been just over 5,000 fatal shootings in the U.S. by an on-duty police officer. The rate at which Black Americans were killed by police is more than twice as high as whites. The overwhelming majority are male, and over 50% are between the ages of 20 and 40. In terms of states, Florida is the third highest in the country. We are also the third in population. California has the most at 831. Texas is next with 499. Then Florida at 372. According to the Sarasota Police Department, there has not been a single fatal police shooting in the past 5 years. 0. The Sheriff's Department reports only 2 instances in the same time period. We begin our conversation with a distinguished name in Florida law, Sean Shaw, a Tampa attorney, 2018 candidate for State Attorney General, former member of the State House, and son of Leander Shaw, Florida's first African-American Chief Justice. Hello, Sean. Thanks for joining us. From your perspective, what are the top police reform priorities in Florida right now?
I think, number one, we need to certainly look at the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights. We need to look at how difficult it is to actually go after these bad officers. Not everybody, but we certainly want to be able to go after those who have repeated citations and repeated citations for excessive force. It's darn near impossible to really go after someone and get them off the force. And we really need to make sure we have a statewide database so that an officer who's had discipline in one jurisdiction can't go to another jurisdiction and they not know about it. We have to do a better job with regard to weeding out the bad officers. And also, I think we really need to have a discussion about the reallocation of funds. I know some people call it defunding the police. I do not. I call it the reallocation of funds. But really, we've got to start thinking outside the box. How do we get at the root cause of crime? We can, have more and more police, or we can start trying to reduce crime and reduce the crime that's associated with poverty, reduce the crime that is associated with police officers getting called rather than social workers, rather than some mental health experts. We really need to start reimagining how we deploy on certain calls. For example, one of the young men who ended up being killed in Atlanta outside the Wendy's parking lot fell asleep in his car in the driveway. There's no reason that that sort of call should have resulted in a man's death. We need to reimagine how we are doing these things so that the right type of response is given in a situation like that, and it doesn't escalate to the point where a man was killed as a result of police getting called because he was asleep in his vehicle. But the advent of these cell phone videos really have revealed to much of the nation what some of us knew, that there's a problem here. And if we're going to deal with this problem, we got to be honest about it. The neck holds and the restraints, a lot of the deaths that we're protesting about right now are a result of these restraints and neck holds and choke holds and placing your knee on somebody's neck in the case of George Floyd. We need to not do these things. And we need to, some of these barbaric practices and that have resulted in multiple deaths, we just need to get past this.
What about body cams? Do you support that?
If it wasn't for body cameras, we wouldn't know about a lot of these incidents. It's not that the number of incidents are going up. It's the fact that they're being recorded and that people can see it that is bringing a lot of this to light. George Floyd's death of 8 minutes and 48 seconds was recorded. And I think it galvanized the nation in a way that sort of when we saw the body of Emmett Till. And I think it's that serious that though a parallel can be drawn. I don't think a lot of America understood what was going on and how bad it was, and what African-American males in particular, why they feel certain ways about the police and why others don't. Well, look at that George Floyd video for 8 minutes and 48 seconds. Look at the people, other officers standing around while the other officers got his knee on the neck. Just look at the video in totality, a video that we wouldn't have in this age. That wasn't a police video, but that was a video of someone recording it. That's why I'm in favor of body cams. I don't know why you wouldn't be in favor of it, other than cost or something like that. But if that's not worth the cost in a police department, I don't know what is. A lot of these incidents where an officer is accused of wrongdoing are dealt with by some sort of apparatus of law enforcement. And I think we've arrived at the point, certainly, where we know we need an outside set of eyes on some of these incidents, maybe all of them. We need an outside set of eyes looking. We cannot just rely on law enforcement to say this law enforcement officer didn't do anything that was wrong in this case. I'm not there anymore. There was a time where I was somewhat okay with that. I'm not at that place anymore. I have certainly changed my mind. I'm at a place that we need a set of outside eyes on this, whether that's a civilian review board, whether that is some board appointed of the public. I don't know how you want to do it, but it can't be just law enforcement officials looking at the conduct of other law enforcement officials. I think we're past that now. We need a set of outside eyes.
What needs to happen?
A lot. One, I'm glad we're here having this discussion. It means that we see that there's a problem. The protests around the world really reveal that we understand there's a problem. When I was growing up, as you said, my father had the talk with me that every Black father has with their son. And I don't think everybody knows that this talk exists in Black families, but it does, particularly father to son. And so he had to talk with me of how to look at police, how to react to police, how to talk to police, where to hold your hands, to not make sudden movements. And this isn't a conversation that's unique. It just so happens when my dad had it with me, he was the Chief Justice of the Florida Supreme Court. That's what it was unique in my situation, which tells you no one is immune from this. No Black family is immune from this. This is a fear that every Black man and every mother of a Black son and every father of a Black son has. And that was darn near 25 years ago when we had that conversation. Look where we are today.
Sean certainly brings an enlightened perspective to the matter. Now, a former Sarasota deputy chief, and Secretary of the Maryland Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services, Steve Moyer.
The police have become the default to take care of everybody, whether they have mental health problems or substance abuse problems. I was the deputy chief of police here in Sarasota. When we get a call that a window's been broken out and someone's acting out and it's a mental health problem, the options are, okay, do you take them to jail or you take them over to First Step or the hospital? And we got to come up with a better if we want better outcomes, we need to develop better systems. And it can't be done overnight. So if a police officer responds to a disorderly person, on the street who's causing harm to himself, he doesn't need to go to jail, but he definitely needs treatment. When you look back at what Chief DePino did here in Sarasota, she created the homeless outreach team. And that's where she took some police officers, put them in a non-arrest mode, and started working with the homeless, but also brought in social workers, to push them in a direction so that they could receive the treatment that they needed.
What about the role of 911 dispatchers now? That's critical on the front end here. If we're going to reform, when a call comes in, who decides who to send out, whether it's an armed, geared up officer or a social worker? How would that work?
I think as you transition to a society where you are able to provide mental health and substance abuse treatment, at first you're still going to need the police officers to be there with the mental health officials for their safety until a level of trust is developed in what the mental health professionals can do and where these people can be receive treatment. So that will also be a wide-reaching change of service because when someone dials 911, the expectation in this country is that the police are coming.
There are more Americans with mental illness in jail than in hospitals. We've seen that. Obviously, it has to change. At the same time, a very disproportionate number of African Americans and minorities in jail. Again, fewer arrests. How can we break that cycle?
It begins with having an ongoing conversation with the community. I'm familiar with a program. It's called the North American Family Institute. They have the YPI program. It's the Youth Police Initiative. And it's working with the community, identifying youth at risk who have not entered the system yet and teaming them up with the police so that they begin to build trust within the police department. When you see some of the things we're seeing on TV right now, without having the full story, it escalates into a total distrust for the police. So these things will continue to occur, but once the conversation starts, you can't stop. You have to continue to push forward because there's always the ability to make things better.
What about the role of 911 dispatchers now? That's critical on the front end here. If we're going to reform, when a call comes in, who decides who to send out, whether it's an armed, geared up officer or a social worker? How would that work?
I think there's a lot of examples out there. I think as you transition to a society where if you're going to change the system, you have to change the services that are available. If a good proportion of the African American and the minority communities are in need of health services, mental health services, and substance abuse treatment that they're not receiving, there's no end in sight if you continue to send it to police in to deal with those situations. So if we know there's a problem and we're trying to increase professionalism and better relationship in the African American community, then we need to be honest with ourselves that we need to change the entire system. But also I think we need to look at the professionalism of policing. You can't have 95% of the police officers doing good things and letting 5% of them causing the problems. I think we need to step back and take a real deep look at, should we require college? Should we look at the research that is out there about the maturity of the juvenile brain. When I was 18, I went to college. When I was 22, I joined the police academy. But knowing that the maturity of the brain doesn't occur till 21, 22 years old, it may be a time where we sit back and say, okay, men and women that want to join a police force, there's things you can do before we put you on the street at the age of 21 or 22. Maybe it's time to work with them, let them grow into the position instead of thrusting them onto the street within weeks after completing an academy.
Excellent insights from Steve. No question, mental health is a daunting challenge for law enforcement. Tragically, an example of this recently occurred right here in Sarasota County. This past August, the family of a 63-year-old grandmother, Adrienne Stevenson, who suffered from dementia, was fatally shot by a Sarasota County Sheriff's deputy. When they unsuccessfully tried to taser her, she was fatally shot. Her family is overwhelmed with grief. They recognize their mother had mental issues, but felt she did not need to be shot and killed. To explain what happened and help us understand the need to reform how law enforcement responds to mental health calls, we turn to Sheriff Tom Knight.
I think where we're at with it right now is that we are at a point in society where we need more mental health, is that you can't use the police to do everything all the time for every purpose, and that the mental health, the safety and security of these people who need or are in distress and need help need something more than a cop. And I don't think it's about defunding the police anymore. I think it's about the evolution of law enforcement and the evolution of our society. Is that we have to go back to remember what Sir Robert Peel created law enforcement for, was the intermediary of policing in the communities and not using the military. And so we have to be open-minded as governments and law enforcement of adding social services within law enforcement. Right now we have now 5 caseworkers inside the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office that we didn't have 11.5 years ago when I took over, that deal with homelessness, they deal with people leaving our jail, and I think that we're coming to a point now where we need caseworkers available to go out with law enforcement on substance abuse and mental health issues. The Sarasota County Sheriff's Office, we Baker Acted over 6,300 people over the last 5 years. Last year alone, we Baker Acted 1,300 people. So that's good when it works out well and we can triage it and get people into counseling. But at the end of the day, that's really not the role of law enforcement. The role of law enforcement is to keep the community safe.
Let's move from duty and service to accountability, discipline, and labor unions. It's well known that your deputies became decertified. Can you give us an example about how union collective bargaining agreements serve to make it harder?
To be quite honest, when I was with the Highway Patrol, we had collective bargaining. It made it very difficult for me to remove inferior people who weren't performing and those people who are bad apples that need to be removed, that the community wants removed, our society wants removed. It made it very, very difficult to remove them from the class. Collective bargaining holds us up. It doesn't hold me up anymore. I can create caseworkers. We're just such more fluid without the hindrance. The community expects their chiefs and their sheriffs to be responsible. And when you get governmental bodies, unions involved, it makes it difficult for police chiefs to set up programs that are beneficial to a community. So they just bog us down.
What are your thoughts on a national registry? And also, what do you think about banning chokeholds?
Number one, chokeholds aren't what people see them to be. Vascular restraint techniques is what they're really called. In the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office, they were banned in 2004. They are in my policy right now. We train the people to use them, but they are accepted as deadly force. So if you don't have your weapon, if you're in that thing, we train them to use them, but they can't use them for any type of restraint, to put handcuffs on people or anything like that. I don't restrict people from being on a neck to get them to the ground, to restrain them. I'm not going to do that. But they can't use that technique as a device for getting people handcuffed. Do I think a national registry for some type of police officer's conduct, if that's what you're asking me, I think in Florida it becomes very, very difficult to get police officers decertified, even though they will do it. As
a former city commissioner, I dealt with the cost and liability issues regarding cameras. So let's take that out of the equation, the cost. In terms of having a record, how do you feel about body cameras? Yes.
I think they're going to be part of contemporary policing. We have 5 of them. We modeled them. One of the things was, like the city of Sarasota, they got sued over it. We have asked the legislative body to change some laws to protect people's privacy rights. So for me, as sheriff at that time, was privacy rights of individuals are important to me, notwithstanding the $2.5 million it would take to implement the program. I do believe they're coming and that I like them. The privacy issue is still a concern for me. But I'm not afraid to put my deputies in them. But at the end of the day, when you talk about body cameras, Minneapolis, Louisville, all these agencies that are under scrutiny right now, all had body cameras on. And body cameras are really, what you hear is transparency, and yeah, they're great. I would love to put my deputies in them, and I will at some point in time probably, or the next administration will, notwithstanding the cost of them, because I think they're great for people to see the great things my people do every day. But at the end of the day, you're still seeing poor behavior by individuals and agencies who have them because of the culture of the organization. It doesn't matter if you have a body camera on, it's not going to change a person's attitude and behavior if the leadership doesn't send that message down. Right now, my final decision on body cameras, I don't know what the next administration will do, but is that in my impression of not everybody, but there's great respect for the deputies that work here, the community supports them, and that up until the time that I need to put them on them, if you got to have a body camera to monitor somebody's conduct, you need a new police chief. You need a new sheriff. That's just the way I see it.
On that note, you recently wrote a really well thought out editorial when you said that reform does start at the top. But isn't the bottom up just as important? Protecting the partner, keeping your mouth shut, or confronting a superior officer if they're out of line. As you mentioned before, that has to change. That culture has to change.
Absolutely. We have self-reporting at times, but we also still have where the thin blue line will exist, and that they will, at times, we're weeding that out. It starts with me, is that it's unacceptable to go to great lengths to protect each other. And so we are working on that hard. We're much better than we were 11 and a half years ago, but the people at the bottom, it starts with the young people. It starts with the academy of the duty and responsibility to do the right thing, what the community expectations are, and that is reporting if you see misconduct amongst your peers. Society expectations are moving so rapidly now that shifting gears in law enforcement needs to be easier to do it all the time. And we do it here, but where you get bogged down a little bit is collective bargaining agreements. To shift that gear makes it hard when you have to go to the table and talk to the people who don't have vision to understand the future of policing. And that you got to have that vision to say it's time to change. It was easier to be a cop when I started in 1987. It's harder to be a cop now, but we know what the community wants. And what the community wants here is less policing and more services.
As Tom knows, reform, like crime, is not a political issue. It is a response to social issues like mental health, racism, and poverty. That said, Michael McHale, one of the nation's top police labor leaders, recently had the honor of speaking at the Republican National Convention.
Unfortunately, chaos results when failed officials in cities like Portland, Minneapolis, Chicago, and New York make the conscious decision not to support law enforcement.
Well, Mick, that was quite a speech. You said that officials in Portland, Minneapolis, Chicago, and New York, quote, made a conscious decision not to support law enforcement. Quite a bold statement. Is that your opinion or one of NEPO?
Well, it's a bit of both. The organizations that we represent within those cities, and we have several, they're not being allowed to do their jobs. They're not being allowed to enforce the laws necessary to ensure people can peacefully protest.
Let's talk about reform.
Sure.
The U.S. Congress just passed the George Floyd Justice and Policing Bill. I'd like to go through some of the items. There are many items on that bill, but some and get your take on them, whether you support some of these or not. Ban the use of chokeholds.
It's more than a yes or no question. There may come a time that that is a last resort to save a life. In a life and death scenario, the officer may not have any other choice.
We talk a lot about having a national registry to track police misconduct. We have this Section 50A, the qualified immunity. What do you say about that?
The qualified immunity only takes place when you made an honest effort or an honest mistake. To the second question that you asked was a national registry. Now, here's a concern that we would have with a national registry. Again, we go back into the due process formulation. What we would like to see is if someone had been found to be at fault, let's create some type of remedy that would allow that individual to participate in identified programs and show clearly that he or she have been rehabilitated. We're fortunate here in the state of Florida that there is a commission. There's a commission, so your local police chief or your local sheriff, he or she doesn't hold that certificate to allow you to be a police officer. It's the state of Florida. So if you're in violation, that commission could take away your certification, and if you're revocated, that's a minimum 10-year period before you could apply to become a law enforcement officer again.
Often said the sheriffs, chiefs of police say they can't manage their own departments because the bargaining agreements are nearly impossible to hold officers accountable. So what do you think about civilian review?
The chiefs and the sheriffs to hide behind that weak position of we cannot discipline, we cannot get rid, that is upon them. When they say that, they're failing to disclose, once again, there's a due process right. And the union has a right, and the union's duty is to represent the men and women of that respective agency.
So how can unions change the culture to a zero tolerance for racism and or excessive force?
As a 30-year member of law enforcement, I'll be the first person to apply handcuffs to someone who intentionally violates someone's civil rights, somebody who intentionally discriminates, and especially someone who utilizes excessive force, which is not necessary. We do not oppose legislation or rules and regulations which compel the reporting of observations by other officers. I never have. I understand it may exist. I'm speaking from my personal experience, that I, as an elected leader of a union, and I, more importantly, as a sworn law enforcement officer, would not tolerate, would not accept, oh, that's just her being her, or him being him. Because at the end of the day, we all have to be able to feel safe in our homes and our places of work and worship.
You got to give Mick credit. He doesn't pull any punches, and he's right that unions do have to be part of the reform conversation. But they are also going to have to make some compromises in their bargaining agreements. And now we turn to a man of the cloth, a spiritual perspective from our local pastor, Kelvin Lumpkin.
The God of the Bible, who the Bible describes as an awesome God, a great God, yet associates himself often through the scriptures with the least of these, the downtrodden. And so there's no doubt in my mind that the Lord is grieved at some of what is going on in America. And you know, it's really frustrating as a pastor.
Did you get the talk when you were a little boy? How did that go? And what did you feel about police after having that talk?
So when I was younger, I got stopped a lot by SPD. I got harassed, quite frankly. Not just SPD, but when I went to college in Daytona Beach, Florida, they were harassing me and stopping me too. I had a vehicle. I'll never forget a Daytona Beach police officer stopping me, followed me, stopped me, and I'm like, well, you know, why you stopped me? You didn't never told me. He said, just give me your license. He says, your license are suspended, which I found out they were not. He tells me to leave my truck and walk home. I just never forgot that. And SPD, actually, when I was in my senior year in high school, I was the only one of my boys, my crew, who had a car. So I was the chauffeur everywhere. I'll never forget, me and two friends were coming from football practice, actually, Sarasota High. I see a cop, I think he's following me, so I'm turning on purpose, and surely enough he's following me, but what he's doing is calling for backup. I didn't know this. The lights come on, they pull us over, and they get out with their guns out on us. And I'll never forget my mom just about had a conniption because she understood what I didn't even understand. If I had just made one move or moved the wrong way, you know, you could have been gone. And we see that playing out now. You make one move, and I think there's implicit bias.
So let's talk about reform. So what are your thoughts on reducing the number of armed officers going into our homes? And the talk is replacing them with counselors, with social workers. More of what the EMS does, that approach. Would that work? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's such a complicated issue. In my mind, I think that the first place I would start if I was chief of police, and I don't know anything about policing, so I think that more diversity training needs to happen. I think that we come with this baggage. I think many officers, I think we all do to some degree. If you live in this country, you come with some baggage with how you see people, you know, and it affects your decision making, how you treat them, how you talk to them. And I think we got to be willing to acknowledge that. I don't think all Americans are racist, but I think we all have some level of prejudice.
So let's talk about Black Lives Matter. Have they changed the conversation?
The sense I get from most black people I know is that everybody I talk to supports the notion, the ideal that Black Lives Matter.
Right.
Supporting the organization might get you a different answer.
That's the difference.
Yeah, yeah. Even the NAACP, I don't think supports the organization. And I think when you talk to a lot of pastors, most don't support the organization. Now, I think they deserve some credit for bringing this issue to the forefront. And my opinion on Black Lives, let me be clear, my opinion on Black Lives Matter is ever forming. And I'm trying to figure it out for myself and think independently. But sometimes there's this thought that there's some other agendas behind not just Black lives. And I think some frustration that some of us have, quite frankly, is Black lives can't just matter when a white cop shoots a black person. Don't get me wrong, and I'm not saying they're wrong for just focusing on that, but I'm concerned about both, and the reason why, this is not theory for me. I've stood over too many caskets in Sarasota. Yeah. And I've preached about 20 murders in my 21 years of pastoring of black men who've been killed, and only one time in those 21 years did a white guy kill a black guy.
Finally, the arc of American history has been a tale of two races, one privileged and one suppressed. And we are divided a nation as I have ever seen, perhaps even surpassing the 60s, maybe worse. Do you still have the dream? And what is your dream?
Well, you know, racial reconciliation is a big deal for me. So I'm hurting, but I'm still hopeful though. But yet, I think within our documents, our founding documents, we've had this ability to kind of correct ourselves slowly, but I see some correction with the Civil War. Then we lost some of those gains with Jim Crow. Then we begin to get some of those rights back. And the fact that our country could elect an African-American president twice tells me that's progress. I don't care what anybody says, that's progress. That in no way suggests that we're there. But I like to think, maybe I'm fooling myself, but I like to think that most Americans want racial reconciliation. One thing about the George Floyd thing is that I've never seen this willingness to talk. I mean, I've had a couple of Zoom meetings with me and some white guys who wanted to talk, who wanted to talk about racism. They want to have a frank talk, and I haven't seen that in my lifetime, a willingness to, let's look at ourselves. And that makes me hopeful.
Well, there you have it. We absolutely do need reform, and we need new federal laws that define standards for law enforcement just like we needed federal civil rights and voting rights laws back in the 60s. We would also do well to recognize that law and order starts with the defense of equal rights and justice for all. For more information about racism in America, Black Lives Matter, reform, and American history, you can visit these sites, and as always, you can watch this episode and all our previous shows on my website, Facebook, and YouTube pages. That wraps up another one. Hope you enjoyed the show and learned something. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'm Suzanne Atwell, and I'll see you around town.